Great. Well, I am Elizabeth Holton. I'm the head of communications at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today in what is now our 4th event in the Conversations with Crosby series, featuring our IMLS Director Crosby Kemper and some very special guests. And today we're very fortunate to have with us novelist, writer, and woman of many credentials, as Crosby will share, Francine Prose, for what promises to be a really exciting discussion. And before I turn it over to Crosby to say a few more words, just a couple housekeeping items. This event is being recorded, and we will share it on the IMLS website and YouTube channel. So on those pages that you had on the IMLS website, you can go back and we'll post the YouTube recording on that page so you can see it, rewatch it, and share it. And we welcome you to ask any questions you like via the question box. There's also the chat box that we can see if you have any technical issues or you want to just shoot us a note. But for the questions, there's that special questions box. You can submit them at any point during this hour of conversation. We'll keep an eye on them and pose them to Crosby and Francine for a Q&A and discussion near the end of the hour. So with that, I'll hand it over to Crosby to introduce Francine and what they'll be talking about. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And Francine, thank you so much for doing this. I think the world knows that you've written 30+ books. Novels, novellas, short stories, criticism, biography. You're an essayist, an advocate. You're the former president of Penn and writer in residence at Bard College, not too far away from where you are located in upstate New York, doing your gardening Candide-like in this best of all possible worlds at the best of all possible times. So thanks for leaving the garden and joining the conversations. One of the things I love about your writing is that you have characters, protagonists, and the folks that they encounter. Swenson, the professor in Blue Angel, or Vincent Nolan, the we hope converted neo-Nazi, who are contradictory, self-questioning, ambiguous, and very humorous, sometimes self-humorous, humorous about themselves rather, complicated and tragic sometimes characters. And now you've published the Vixen, and the Vixen's about the Rosenbergs, and yet it's also a funny, witty look at the mid-50s, the early 50s, mid-50s, with the CIA and the Rosenbergs and Roy Cohn wandering through. How do you get away with that? How do you do that? What's that all about, the humor in particular?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about that. In the class that I'm teaching at Bard in the fall, and I taught a class in the prison in Eastern Correctional Facility last spring, and both classes were kind of wound up being about sympathy, about how a writer creates sympathy for character. And one of the things that the students were talking about was the way in which, in some of the texts I was teaching, humor made you sympathetic to characters in a way you might not normally be. Now, I mean, I'm only speaking to myself. I mean, that is, I find humor to be a very sympathetic quality. I mean, I'm sure that there are people who think it's a quality of the devil and they have a completely different attitude, but that's my own feeling. So when I'm writing characters who are complicated, but I want us to feel a certain kind of interest in and sympathy for, humor is one of the ways that I try to kind of, create that aura around a character.
So it seems to me that I mean, a word that occurs in a couple of places in your essays in particular is the word forgiveness. And it seems to me one of the things that you do brilliantly with these characters is they're either self-aware or they're becoming self-aware. And sometimes it's the humor, their sense of humor about not only themselves, but other people, and the mistakes that they or these folks that they're gathering with, mistakes that they all make, their sense of humor about it allows them to become more self-aware, and maybe that's the, you know, in the German term Bildungsroman, that's how they build their lives. It's by recognizing themselves, and they can only do that because they have a sense of humor about it. You can do that as an author because you have a sense of humor about them.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, there's scenes. There's a scene in the Vixen where our hero goes to have lunch with this very sort of sad, disappointed poet whose book is not going to do well. Yeah, and I like to write scenes which are so excruciating that they're funny. They're just so awful that they're funny, because I don't know, I just think it's a good idea to acknowledge that things like that happen. You know, that, I mean, because basically I just think we're flawed creatures. We're just flawed creatures. We're not perfectible. And once we learn to live with that, I can't help but think it would make us nicer to each other.
So I thought you were going to talk about the lunch that Simon, our hero, has with his uncle Matty, who's a literary critic and you know, sort of a sellout, but who also has some witty things to say. He's very condescending to everybody else, but he has some witty things to say. And your character Simon and you, the author, are making fun of Uncle Matty during the whole lunch, but then slowly but surely it becomes very humorous about Simon because he's getting drunk. While he's trying to distance himself from, or he's discovering the not very nice things which he already knew about his uncle. And it's a wonderful scene in which Simon can barely stand up at the end. The waiter has to help him out.
Yeah, no, the uncle's a monster. The uncle's a monster, and the uncle is. I mean, we've all met these guys. They're all about knowing everybody in the room and then trash talking the person that they've just been friendly to. I mean, just horrible people. But my first editor, who at least that restaurant is based on, was nothing like that. He was a wonderful person. But at the end, the scene where Simon falls over because he isn't used to drinking, it happened to me. I mean, that was my first lunch with my first editor. This was in the 70s, and I hadn't been a drinker in college. I just didn't, and I didn't know what to order. I just didn't know what to, so I ordered, I mean, the way it happens in the novel, I ordered a whiskey sour, and my editor was just horrified that anyone would, and then we split a bottle of wine and I fell over. But I was trying to write about the 70s, which was like the 50s in a way, which was, men in particular, were judged by what they drank and didn't drink. And to order a whiskey sour was like the worst thing you could possibly do.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is the arts and humanities in the life of museums and libraries and the nation. And you wrote a piece 4 years ago in The Guardian about the humanities and what was happening, particularly focused on the university world, in which universities were dismantling philosophy departments, humanities majors were floating away, administrators were getting big salaries to administrate God knows what. And you particularly defended the humanities based on the idea that the humanities teach critical thinking. And the question I want to ask you about that is, it seems to me that the phrase critical thinking is probably the single most misused phrase in our intellectual world. It frequently is anything but critical. It's almost never self-critical. And that's one of the things that has affected the humanities, is that we don't use the humanities to truly open our minds up to real criticism, which is always an expansion of the mind. What did you mean by critical thinking? What constitutes critical thinking?
Well, it's so interesting you're saying that, because as you say it, I realize there are many, many ways in which you can understand that phrase. In a way, I just mean thinking. I mean, the humanities, philosophy, history, all of it so complicates your sense of the world that it gives you a way of or of human beings or human nature. It gives you a way of, what do I want to say, of processing information that you're getting, or of figuring out what might be true of and what you're hearing, which is, has never been more important. I mean, it just gives you a way of sorting through the unlikely, or even paying attention to language. For several years at Bard, one of my students' out of class assignment was to read the same story in 3 different newspapers and to write about the way language was used just to spin a very simple story. So even the way in which humanities makes us more thoughtful, attentive to the world is incredibly useful.
Well, I mean, there are 2 things there that I think are interesting. Number one, you used the phrase in the Guardian piece, tolerating ambiguity, which is kind of, I think, what you do with your characters, is you not really tolerate ambiguity. You embrace it, and you analyze it, and you use it for humor, but you also use it for understanding. And then the second thing in that, and you have so much fun with this in your writing, particularly in your criticism, is the notion of, and foreign languages are a discipline, and study of anything in depth is in the humanities can be a discipline, and there are rules in a discipline, and you have a lot of fun with rules which we really like and need. At the same time, you talk about Chekhov and more than once. Obviously, you're a Chekhovian, and you talk about teaching a class and telling them about the rules of writing, and then each step along the way, you read another Chekhov story in which he violates those rules. That the rules are out there, but we need to violate them regularly, or at the best, if you're Chekhov, you get to violate them.
Yeah, well, sure. Although, Chekhov really is a deep well. I mean, you can keep going back because there's so much there. And I mean, for example, speaking of again, just returning to Sympathy, I mean, he has this famous quote in one of his letters where he says, it's not the writer's job to judge our characters, but just to portray what kind of people they are. He says, because he's written this story about these horse thieves, and whoever he's writing to, Suvarin, says, you didn't say that how horrible they were. And Chekhov says, oh, I just have to show you what kind of people they are and what their tastes are and what their passions are, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I've been quoting this for years. It's, seems like such a great quote, blah, blah, blah. And it occurred to me like a couple of months ago, and I'd never read the Chekhov story about the horse thieves. I'd been like, blah, blah, blah about what he says about the story, but I hadn't read the story. So I go and read the story, and the story, there is nothing redeeming about these characters. I mean, they are completely, they are so judged. There's nothing decent about these people. So I don't know, it just made it all the more interesting. I mean, here he was saying there are no rules of a certain kind, but he was making another kind of rule and then breaking even that one in the story because that was the way he saw the characters.
Right. So, one of the things you say in light of Chekhov, or you have an essay on clarity, and the thing that Chekhov does with clarity, he's the most lucid of all writers, is it reveals character. And so, in essence, the judgment's there in the reporting, if you will. He makes the judgment of not by telling you, but by showing you the character.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, maybe this sounds simple-minded, but I think it's important to be understood. And I don't understand, on the other hand, I mean, there are writers who are very, like Beckett, for example. I mean, understanding Beckett, or Joyce, it takes a lot more work than it does, or Proust, it takes a lot more work. But I think, the main thing when I'm dealing with students, I don't teach writing, but they have to write an essay every week. I'm just saying, look at this sentence and see if someone could understand what you're saying, which seems to me so basic about writing and so often ignored.
Yeah, understanding, I think, is a word that's frequently missing in our dialogue, in the critical dialogue in the humanities. We're always looking for some kind of silver bullet variable in the world that will teach us everything we need to know, and understanding is a little more complex than that. So I want to talk about museums. Of course, museums play a major role in your characters' lives, and a lot of stories and novels. They're constantly visiting museums, encountering paintings. But you've also written eloquently about a couple of museums. In particular, I'm thinking of your book about Anne Frank and the Anne Frank Museum, and your book about Peggy Guggenheim. And her creation of a series of art galleries, and then finally the museum in Venice. And you have in your book What to Read and Why, you have 10 reasons that the arts are important. You have an essay, 10 reasons that the arts are important. And all those relate, it seems to me, to the museum world. In your book about Anne Frank, there's a section about the museum, and you describe the museum. And one of the interesting things to me is the sort of portal effect that the recreation of the museum. They reestablished the bookcase that had to be moved for them to get into the space, the annex, the attic space where the Franks lived. And you describe that, and then you describe the annex to the annex, which is the foundation, and you describe all the things that they're doing. And then you describe your disagreement with Cynthia Ozick on the importance of the outreach efforts of the museum. And talk a little bit about the importance of that museum, what it means, and whether or not it's in any way cheapened by the activities. You talk also about the movie and the play and all of that. What's the meaning of the museum? Why should we go see it?
Well, it's physical proof that a certain thing happened. Well, it's physical proof. I mean, what happened in that house happened in that house, and it happened for a reason. It happened because the family had to hide for their lives there and to save their lives. And it's important to see it. And also, it's kind of reasonable in its portrayal. I mean, I've seen Holocaust memorials that are so over the top and off-putting for that reason, but it's not elaborate, and it is faith. It's in as far as it's possible, with zillions of people walking through all the time, faithful to the events that transpired there.
So, and Cynthia Ozick says that the divorce of the museum divorces Anne Frank in the movie and the play too, I guess she means, but the museum and all the things that they're doing. You write about her sense that Otto Frank, her sense that Otto Frank indulged people's identification with Anne Frank too much, but that it divorces her from the not merely tragedy, but the horror of the Holocaust. It becomes a teenage romance story in essence, but you don't have that. You don't buy that reaction.
No. I mean, only a very stupid teenager would not ask how she died so young, or why she died so young, or why she was in that attic in the first place. I mean, it's not, you can't really reduce it to a love story. And also, you can't hold an institution or a book responsible for the use that's been made of it. I mean, if you were gonna hold the Bible responsible for every horrible biblical film that had been made, you'd have to. It's not the diary's fault, and it's not the museum's fault. I mean, and also, I mean, I know what she's talking about, but I think, so what? I mean, one of the things, I don't know if they're still doing it, but one of the things they were doing was they had these traveling exhibits of, and, with Anne Frank's diary with placards and quotes and so forth, and they take it to various places in the world. So they took it to Argentina, and the victims of the dirty war and the perpetrators of the dirty war both came together to look at the exhibit and to talk, which is a good thing. I mean, whether or not this made any lasting change, I don't know. But I can't see how that's harmful. And I can't see how that's betraying the horror of the Holocaust to use it to possibly make one situation slightly better.
And I agree with you. And what I was really getting at is in your 10 reasons that the arts are important. You talk two of the reasons. One is they move us, and there's no question the story of Anne Frank, the diary, the story, the museum. I've been there too. It's a moving experience. There's a traveling Auschwitz exhibit right now. It happens to be in Kansas City, and I went through that, and she's there, and it is a moving experience. But then the other question, you make the statement as a question, does it make us better? Do the arts and humanities make us better? And so that there's this question in the Anne Frank book about her statement about finding in her diary the goodness in human beings, even as she's going through this incredible experience. Of course, it's before she goes to Auschwitz, but and of course that's actually taken out of context a little bit. She doesn't actually. She talks about the horrors before and after that statement. But you do feel that there's a potential for appeal to the best in human nature that comes out of experiences like this.
Experiences, yes. I mean, art, I don't know. I think, I mean, my own experience has been that there are certain things you read that you actually think, I'm going to be a better person. But I've also noticed that it doesn't last for very long. I mean, it's good for like 45 minutes. It's good until somebody cuts in line in the supermarket, and whether or not you've read Dostoevsky's Father Zosima's speech the night before, doesn't make you less irritated.
So, later in your list of 10, there's another that's almost this kind of the same question, but it's a little subtler. It's I'm going to paraphrase, I think now. Does it help you understand human beings, goodness and maybe evil? And that it seems to me the clear question, the clear answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
It helps us
absolutely.
understand. It may not help us act better, but it helps us. It helps us analyze it better.
Or know it exists, or know certain things exist, or know the way certain things have been happening all the way through history, and they happen. And there's certain recurrent patterns in human behavior that you can go back and maybe I said this, but I was reading a lot of Plutarch this winter, and reading his lives about why I continue to teach the classics, because shockingly people's relationships to take just one thing, power, were as complex and twisted and noble, whatever, complicated, back in 1st century AD, BC, as they are now. I mean, it's just the same things repeat themselves. So, and I just think it's useful to know. It's useful to know. I mean, whether it makes you a different person.
It helps us. And so now shifting gears entirely to Peggy Guggenheim. So you wrote a biography of Peggy Guggenheim, and she's led a fascinating life, and she was directly engaged and responsible for the promotion of a lot of modern art. Her galleries in New York and elsewhere, and then eventually the museum in Venice, which of course she spent a lot of time. She's you make her into, we're really interested in all her lovers and her sex life and all that, but you make her into a kind of heroic figure, going through her life, and persisting in this, in understanding, promoting modern art, and I that it really came through to me that she she and the museum were an important thing in the history of modern art. And the one thing I want to ask you about is her relationship to beauty. It seems to me that I was relatively recently in the museum, and one of the things I was startled by was I felt there was a Peggy Guggenheim aesthetic in the museum, something that the nature of the things that she collected, the lines were very important to her, strong lines and the mixture of the lines with color and the portal to the museum and the garden and the sense that it's got a certain scale which is much smaller than most modern art museums, which has surprised me. My previous memory was that it was larger than it was, and that beauty was important to her. You know, she comes across as in telling the life as this hard heroic character, and maybe sad in some of her emotional complexity. But
Well, you know, I always thought that her favorite piece, I mean, she doesn't say this, but the way she was Brancusi's Bird in Flight, you know, which was just pure line, pure line. I mean, no, you know, I kind of, in a way, when I was finishing the book, I thought I'd written it backwards because I'd been to the Guggenheim collection years ago, and then I wrote most of the book, and then I went to the collection again, and I was so blown away by what she collected. And also she saved this stuff. You know, it was like, because she got it out of Europe right before the Nazis, who hated that kind of art, invaded France. So she was just buying up all this stuff and putting it in crates with her laundry and sending it back to New York, or it just would have disappeared somewhere. So, I mean, her collection's amazing. And she had this incredible eye. I mean, you know, people, I don't know. I mean, I've heard people who know her talk about, well, a very famous art critic said to me, oh, she was so stupid. But I don't think she was stupid. I think she was really smart. And then people say, oh, she just had a very good sense for advisors, you know, because Duchamp told her what to buy and, you know, a series of advisors, blah, blah. But I just think she had a real eye. She had a real eye, and that was her life. I mean, that was her passion. And plus she was funny. I mean, speaking of humor, her memoirs are hilarious. I mean, she has this kind of weirdo, droll tone. And even when things are just horrible, she has this humor. I mean, she's very, very good. She's a very good writer.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the experience of museum and, you know, not any and all museums, but the particularly important experiences that we sometimes have, and many of your characters have. There's a moment at the end of Golden Grove where Nico, the heroine, our teenage heroine, goes with her father, who she's had a very rocky relationship with, on their pilgrimage to see Ghirlandio's, sorry, I'm getting this backwards, to Fra Angelico's Last Judgment. It's, you know, it's a wonderful scene because it's sort of it's the moment she grows up, in a way, in what she sees, that there's so many things in this painting, and somehow, you know, it unites her with her father. There are experiences like that throughout your writing.
Well, I've been to a lot of museums, Crosby. I mean, I'm married to a painter. I write about art. I love looking at paintings, and I love museums. I mean, I just love museums. There's some obviously I love better than others, but when we would travel a lot, we would never not go to the museum, and sometimes it didn't matter. I mean, of course, the great museums, you know, the Prado and the Louvre and blah blah, but then also some little French provincial museum where they had like 100 Dutch flower paintings in the same room. I didn't care. I mean, it's just interesting, and you know, I love the smell of museums and the furniture polish or whatever, and so forth. So, and then there are great museums. I mean, there are 2 museums in Sicily that Scarpa designed, which are just the best that a modern museum could be, I think.
So you did an interview with an author, Dune Arbus, a little while ago, November last fall, about her novel, The Caretaker, in which it's a sort of similar thing to Albert Barnes and the Barnes collection that her characters involved in. But in this you quote Philip Guston. There's a great quote from Philip Guston, which you relate to writing. She relates to writing, but it seems to me it's about the ultimate museum experience, in which you, as a writer painter, he's obviously talking about painting. You know, when he gets going, he eliminates the sense of the outside world, and then he eliminates the sense of character. Ultimately, he eliminates the sense of himself. And that's when he knows he's really engaged. And it seems to me that that's the great museum experience. And some of your characters have museum experiences like that. There's a short story called Ghirlandaio, in which our heroine, and again with father, has a deep experience with the Ghirlandaio painting. And it seems to me that you know that we've all had that experience. Anybody who loves museums, anybody who loves art has had the experience of having something that takes you out of yourself so far that you don't even know you're there. You're in the painting, or you're in the sculpture, or the exhibit is taking you away.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I really believed, I mean, we had art books around the house. We had some art books around the house, and I really believed that I semi-believe, let me put it that way, that if you looked at a painting long enough, you could get in it. And in fact, get inside it. I mean, there was some, one of these omnibus British sort of semi-ghost film, they made films in the 30s and 40s that had several British short stories. And one was about horror stories. And one was about a guy that goes into a painting in a museum. And it was like my favorite thing. So I think part of me has always, I understand that doesn't happen now, but part of me feels that way. I mean, you can just look at a painting and keep seeing more and more things in it, and it's not a bad way to pass time.
Well, and one of your other 10 reasons for the arts is it's time travel. And it's a little bit like that, the experience you've just described, the 30s British movie with going into a painting. We're in somebody else's story, and the story can be gripping and can take us away. I mean, we were talking earlier about Thomas Cole paintings. I mean, if there is his History of Empire series of paintings, and they're all engrossing paintings, and you feel like you're there with them, just as civilization rises and civilization falls, all in the same place, and you recognize the landscape, and you begin to think about our own times and where are we in the decline and fall. But it seems to me that it is time travel, that we go to a museum for the same reason that we read a great book, or even a good book that's just engrossing, is to take us away from ourselves, take us into another place, to visit somewhere else. Somewhere else, it seems to me, is the great thing about museum going and reading a great book.
And writing a great book, or writing a book, period. I mean, you're not yourself. That's, as I said, that's the point of the Philip Guston quote, where he says, "Fine, if you're lucky, you leave the room." So you're not
Right.
present, and you're something else is kind of pouring through you in some, I don't know what, mysterious, interesting way.
You also talk about the power of shock as one of your 10 reasons for the arts and humanities. What's the good? There's a lot that's shocking in our world today. I mean, we've been given a whole series of shocks over the last couple of years: the political shocks, the racial shocks, the pandemic shock, and our concern about inequality and things like that. All shocks to our system. What can the arts do with shock that can that can help us through this? I mean,
Well, it can get better. I mean, it's always shocking when it gets, when art itself gets better, and it can make you see things in a new way or see art in a new way. I mean, one of my favorite art exhibits I ever went to, speaking of museums, was the Guggenheim had a 1900 show curated by Robert Rosenberg. And it started with all these, like, it was all 1900, right? So it started with all these kitschy genre scenes. I mean, these horrible, 1900 sentimental, realist. And then you went up and went up. And at the end, there's Cezanne and Gauguin and Van Gogh and all done at the same time. And it makes you, and it's shocking. And it can kind of restore your sense of like something really different happened. And I think it changed how people saw the world around them, or color or light or planes or so forth. So it's good every so often.
And it seems to me that one of the powers of the traveling exhibit, the famous painting, whether it's a Mona Lisa or whatever, going to visit the Egyptian exhibit, the permanent Egyptian hall in the Met, or whatever it might be, is that it provides an opportunity for conversation with a person you may go with. You have some funny comments about guided tours and the promotion of the recorded tour and that sort of thing. You've got one guided tour of hell, which is an actual guided tour in one of your novellas to Auschwitz.
Yeah, speaking of which, maybe it was the Auschwitz exhibit you mentioned earlier, but there at some point there was some Auschwitz exhibit in a museum downtown. I'm not sure exactly. And there was an ad for it on the sides of buses in the city. And you'd be crossing the street and a bus would go by that said Auschwitz, like, oh my God, No, I hate guided tours. I just hate guided tours. I hate them more and more. I mean, I've been on many, many interesting ones, but there's so many that aren't interesting. That the last few I've been on, I've just like had to flee in the middle. So that anxiety is,
It seems to me that one of the great things about going to a museum is going to a museum and exhibit, or the permanent exhibit, or just going to see one painting or one thing that you love, going with someone, going with your spouse, or going with your best friend, and talking about it and experiencing it and experiencing somebody else's experience of it.
When I was writing art criticism for the Wall Street Journal, I would go with Howie, my husband, and I would just write down everything he said, and that would be the article.
Of course, Howie is an artist.
Yeah, well,
that's
right.
fair.
Yeah.
And with the guided tour, the thrusting that upon you, not to mention, sort of the Met pioneered and everybody else has joined in with a blockbuster exhibit, and the store at the end is everybody's goal to buy a tchotchke related to the exhibit. And the leisurely stroll, which is hard to do now that you've got 10,000 people in the same room with you, but the leisurely stroll and the conversation, the sort of Proustian aspects of museum going are difficult to come by these days.
I know it's different. Well, honestly, I don't like the time ticket thing, because it just changes the whole experience. I mean, you can't, if you're in a city, you can't say, oh, let's go to the blah, blah Museum of Art and look at, now you have to know in advance and do a thing on your computer and so forth. And it's different. I understand the reasons for it. I get it. But that alone changes the experience. And also, I'm not, I think in a lot of places, the museum shut down because of COVID. And now, there's certain things that I noticed that just seem like they were done by people who had too much time on their hands. And now it's going to revert back to some other, but, just unnecessary, fiddling with collections in ways that don't seem inspired, especially.
Well, of course, every new curator has to come in and do something new. That's the nature of the game. And the Museum of Modern Art, I notice, about every decade they have to redo everything completely, and they're not alone in feeling the necessity of doing that. But whether or not they improve things, and obviously over the years there's lots of disagreement about that. So one notion that I get from reading Francine Prose is the notion of a kind of pilgrimage to certain paintings, certain places, and where if you were the pandemic is over and you can go anywhere you want. Is there a place that you would want to go, a museum you'd want to go to, a place of art that you would want to go to that speaks to you over your lifetime?
Now that I haven't been to, or that I would, well,
Well, not that you necessarily haven't, but one you haven't been to, sure. But I'm just wondering if there, you reach a certain stage where you want to revisit some things too. Just as rereading, you talk about rereading, and the things that you reread are become important. Do you have the same experience with museums and artwork?
I want to go. If I could go anywhere, I want to see the monasteries in Georgia. I mean, I'm really into fresco painting, medieval fresco painting, and a friend of mine just did this, and I've been reading about it. And they have these incredible monasteries with still paintings from the 13th century. I mean, I saw some of them, and I've been really into Byzantine art for quite a while now. So, like, I went to northern Greece just to look at the Byzantine art museum. So.
I can't remember where I saw it, but I was looking at some of these in Turkey that are essentially monasteries in caves.
In Cappadocia, the Cappadocia,
right. Those are extraordinary.
Yeah, and Georgia too. I don't know, those places appeal to me more and more. I mean, there are plenty of museums I love, but I don't know what the museums you can't. The thing of the crowd. I mean, I twice went to go see the Alice Neal Museum show at the Met, and there were huge lines, and it was like I just can't,
But that does tell you something about the end of the pandemic. That, I mean, Alice Neal, I think, is a wonderful painter, but she, that she would be that popular at this stage is really interesting.
I know.
From a lot of different points of view, but it does tell you the pandemic is, in many people's minds, is
I'm knocking on wood, Crosby. I just knocked on wood. So yeah.
So is there at the you talk about the Ghirlandaio painting in one story, and you talk about Fra Angelico and Hieronymus Bosch, and at various moments, is there one painting in the world that speaks to you, or does this change over time? Now you want to go and visit the Georgian
the monasteries? Yeah, I mean, there's some, all sorts of things. I mean, they're speaking of churches. I mean, there are a lot of mosaics that I would go back to again and again, just because they were designed in such, like Santa Maria in Trastevere or in various parts of Sicily, because they're designed in a way that the light hits them at a certain times of day and various parts of the mosaic, of the gold mosaic. And that's like, you could watch it for 24 straight hours, because it's so beautiful. So there are places like that. I mean, and I'd like to go to, my taste in art, or what I love most, just changed from time to time, but for a long time, I've loved Sienese painting. I mean, speaking of not being someplace else. So it'd be nice to go to Siena and just spend whole days looking at Sienese art.
I noticed in your book on Caravaggio, you were able to make a link that I'd never seen in Caravaggio before, mainly because I haven't seen that much of Caravaggio. The Nelson here in Kansas City's got a really great Caravaggio, but with Naples and Rome and Malta and Sicily, with the various places that he lived, frequently for very short periods of time, with the street life and also with the time of his life, the various ways he plays with light and darkness. It seems to me that one of the great things that you are able to pull out of a painter and a painting is their ability, which is your ability as a writer as well, to pay attention, the art of paying attention. And so much of our museum going is walking quickly to get through the exhibit, to say you've been through the exhibit, to see everything, instead of standing in front of that one painting or that one, whatever whatever the medium is, that work, and absorbing it and paying attention. And it's a problem, I think, in the contemporary world with everything that's going on in the media, the social media, the internet, et cetera. We have lost the ability to pay attention.
Well, the only reason I can write about art at all is because I can describe what I see. And that seems to me pretty basic. And that was the only reason I thought I could write the Caravaggio book, because there was a great biography of him, of Caravaggio, by Helen Langdon, that had already been written. But that wasn't her principal interest, was describing the paintings. I mean, it was more about what happened. So, and that just takes a long period of looking at the painting. My model for writing about art, because so much of writing about art is completely jargon ridden and unintelligible, and you can't even begin. My model was Sister Wendy. Remember the strange nun that lived in a little airstream on the grounds of the convent? And she wrote these books, or she had a TV show, and she just described what was in the painting. She described what was in the painting, and it was, I mean, this was especially in the 90s and the 2000s, given how much writing about art was completely unintelligible. It was a revelation to me that you could just do that. So that's always been the way I've begun writing about art.
So at one point in Golden Grove, you've got Nico standing in front of Fra Angelico's Last Judgment, and you have her thinking, she's standing there with her father, how astonishing that one painting could tell so many stories. That seems to me to be a great description of you. I feel how astonishing it is that Francine Prose can tell all these stories, and in so many different ways, in so many different modes. Do you think of yourself as a storyteller in the fiction and the nonfiction and the criticism?
I guess so. I mean, I'm pretty surprised myself, Crosby. So I, the evidence would suggest that yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, exactly. There's plenty of evidence out there that's true. I mean, you refer to yourself, as you're talking about teaching writing and describing writing, as a reporter, and it's what you talk when you talk about Chekhov. There's an aspect of this where you seem to me to diminish the creativity of the imagination of what you do, which is also true of Chekhov. He's not really just a reporter. He's crafted it. You quote I think it's The Lady with the Dog, the end of The Lady with the Dog, where there's his statement that it's basically the ultimate statement about whether or not there are happy endings is that they've decided to get married. Is that Lady with the Dog, where they've decided to get married, and it's the beginning of the complications and the struggle.
No, yeah, they realized that the hardest part was still before them. That's how it ends.
Right, the hardest part.
They realized that the hardest part was still before them.
And creating the ability for us to understand that that the life beyond the story is an extraordinary thing that Chekhov is able to do, and that you do. Just to sense that. So I thought we might have some questions Elizabeth, do we have any questions from the audience that you've
We
picked up?
do. We do. We have a question from Sophia. She's interested in learning more about, Francine, your Fulbright experience, and if you had any culture shocks that had an impact on your writing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's so odd because before we began, Crosby said, we're going to talk about Yugoslavia. Well, actually, that was my Fulbright experience. It was in the former Yugoslavia, excuse me, in the late 80s, just a few years before the war began. Yeah, it was shocking. I mean, it was the whole experience. It was fascinating and then later shocking, although, well, really not so much because why? Because I traveled all over the country and it was, I mean, it didn't take a genius to pick up on the various tensions that were going on between different groups in the country, different nationalist groups. So yeah, and then, you know, I mean, the relation of shock. I mean, we all went to the bridge over Mostar, the 12th century bridge. You know, our kids were there, and then the shock of watching the news, and there it was across the river, and then it wasn't there. It had gotten blown up in the war. So it was one of those startling, and I was glad my kids saw that and understood what had happened.
Yeah, and you have a list at the end of reading like a writer of books you have to read immediately, and two of those books are Rebecca West's books. Birds Fall Down, which I agree with you. I think it's one of the underrated novels, and I think it's a wonderful book. But Black Lamb and Gray Falcon, which is of course about what you're talking about, or about the world that you're talking about, which is I think a great but problematic book.
Well, it's weird. It's a weird book because there are things going on that she doesn't tell you. But she was a great describer. I mean, I carried that book all around for Yugoslavia. The book is like 800 pages long, weighs a ton. But speaking of medieval monasteries and churches, she would describe the churches on the near the Albanian border. And this was after 60 years. Her description was dead accurate. I mean, the way, you know, the scaffolding that was set up. So I would just read her description of a place before I got to the place, and it was startling, you know, after half a century, how right on the mark she was.
There's another writer who writes about the same part of the world, Patrick Leigh Fermor, who I also think is wonderful, and again the description of particularly the religious, but both the sites and the people, their devotion in various ways is pretty extraordinary.
Another amazing, you know, Christ Stopped at Eboli. That's another one about southern Italy that's just beautiful.
Right. Are there any more questions, Elizabeth?
Yes, we have one about escapism. You spoke about the great feeling of escaping into a book or painting. Do you see elements of escapism on the rise due to current events, or is this something you think has always attracted us to museums and libraries?
I don't know why that question makes me laugh. It's a really good question. Well, of course. I mean, you know, there's so many pressures and there's so many frightening, to be perfectly honest, frightening things going on. The urge to escape. I mean, of course, it's always been, you know, frightening things have always gone on, but the pleasure of just getting away from it, if even just in your head for a certain period of time, would naturally be attractive.
Did it change? Did the pandemic change your reading habits at all?
Changed my sleeping habits, which in turn changed my reading habits. I read more in the middle of the night. It kept changing. I mean, for a while, I was so upset that all I could read were like sort of domestic novels written by women in the 1930s, taking place in the country. I mean, it was like eating cream of wheat, but a little better than that. And then, then I would read biographies and so forth. But finally, no. Finally, no. I mean, it's always been the same. Like there are times when I just read all the time, and then there are times when for some reason I can't read for a while, and then I'll start reading it.
So mine changed a little bit. I used it as an excuse to go back and read things that I'd always considered were frivolous. Now I've decided they weren't really frivolous, like P.G. Wodehouse, who I think is a great novelist of manners at the end of the day. But I also tried reading Anthony Trollope. He knew he was right. I've started it 3 or 4 times, and I've finally gotten into the middle of it.
I can't read it. I can't read Trollope. Everyone's told me it's so great, and it has to be. Lots of people I respect have told me it's great, but I just keep bouncing out of it, and I don't know why.
Well, I'm still stuck in the middle. If you knew he was right, I got that far anyway. It's sitting on my bedside table waiting to pick it up again. So, Elizabeth, any more questions?
We do. We're nearing the top of the hour, and we have one last question for you, though I think you may want to spend a few more minutes on it, but it's related to the last one. And it says, in this age of information, when we are increasingly overwhelmed by digital content and misinformation, what role do books or stories and storytelling play in the future of American culture and society?
Wowee. Any other big questions out there? I don't know. I mean, I just think, what do I think? I mean, here's what I think. They're not called humanities for nothing. I mean, humanity actually means something. It means our species and what it is that makes us the beings that we are. And I think, I think that books can help remind us of that. I mean, it's something else. I mean, I understand the way in which our phones and news addiction is telling a certain kind of story, and books are still telling a different kind of story, but it's a kind of story that's been told for a very long time, and we hope it's going to continue to be, because that's who we are as again, a species. And I don't know, it's a comfort a little bit.
Yeah, that's I think is reason number 9, and your 10 reasons for the arts and humanities, that is comfort or refuge, and we certainly all needed that, and could use some more of it. So, my advice is keep reading Francine Prose, and Francine Prose, keep writing.
I'll try and do that, and everybody should. Thank you, Crosby. Thank you so much.
See, thank you. This has been a great conversation, as always. And thanks everyone for listening and watching.
Thanks so much. And as a reminder, this conversation will be recorded and posted on imls.gov. To close this out, we actually had one more late question.
Okay, great.
Would love to know more about Francine's frivolous reading to end on a light note. Francine, if you want to share a couple things.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, for example, there's a writer named Dorothy Whipple who wrote it in the 30s and 40s, and she writes these domestic novels and they're sort of like watching really good masterpiece theater or TV, but better than that. So I read everything she wrote, and then for other reasons, I had to go and I reread Molly Keane, who was an Irish novelist from the 50s and so forth, who's very, very funny and very dark actually, but very funny. So I don't know, I mean, maybe frivolous was the wrong word, but it was just, they were amusing and distracting, and to be honest, all I could handle at that point. Although Molly Keane I could handle it at any point.
Yeah, she's a wonderful writer. I think she's being republished now.
Oh yeah, New York Review Books is publishing Good Behavior, which is her great novel. Yeah. Super fun. Speaking of funny, I mean.
Yeah, no kidding. Family Breakdown. Well, I guess is that it, Elizabeth? Are we?
That's it. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending.
Okay.
And we're gonna
Francine, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank all of you.
take care, everyone. Thanks.